Hello. I am here today with Arman Jaffer, CEO and founder of Brisk Teaching. Brisk has been a company I've been following quite closely over the past few years. I talked about y'all a little bit in my end of year update as a part of the ed tech market that I expected to keep growing at a really fast velocity following the past couple of years of growth in the space. And particularly, what we're here to talk about today is the sense of quality in instructional materials and what y'all are doing to improve the whole field in that sense, not just your own products, but trying to set the bar high for what that means. But before we get into that, I'm already getting out ahead of myself. I'd love to hear more about who you are and how you ended up where you are. Like, what inspired you to go? You've worked for a number of really cool organizations in the education space. I'm trying to remember, is this your first entrepreneurial journey, or had you been an entrepreneur before? Tell me about your career.
Yeah, it has definitely been my first entrepreneurial journey. And I've been so grateful for the chance to kind of do the work that we've done and have the chance to impact the lives of so many teachers, students, and their communities. But yeah, my career, I am not a classroom teacher. And so always start there because I think it's really important if you're working in classrooms to really name the perspective that you come in from. My background is as a technologist and a policy person. I watched The West Wing growing up, and so I always wanted to work in the White House and had the chance to do that under the tail end of the Obama and then a little bit under Trump administrations. And from there, joined the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, where I spent 5 years really cutting my teeth in education, kind of working in a philanthropy that was focused on being able to drive high quality instruction, particularly project based learning, and other types of learning science aligned instruction. And through that process, felt like I learned a couple of things. The first was that, teachers honestly don't have enough capacity. They're not given enough tools or the right set of tools, and the time and the size of classes to actually effectively implement high quality instruction when it is also there's so much that's required in order to be a teacher that is able to take advantage of all the different ways in which pedagogy might drive student learning. And so my one thesis really with Brisk was like, how can we just make teaching easier? And then the second part of it was something that I really picked up during the pandemic, working with a ton of different educators, was just the number of different tools that teachers are using. Ed tech actually has made high quality teaching much harder. In some ways, I feel like the thing that really is lacking in the modern classroom is instructional coherence. And it's purely because of the number of tabs that a teacher has to manage in order to implement high quality instruction, whether it's bouncing between a learning management system, a curriculum platform, and SIS, and the dozens of different other supplementary ed tech products that are currently in classrooms. And so much of what became Brisk was really this feeling that capacity and instructional coherence were the two things that we could really move the needle on. And so founded Brisk in 2023, really based on that belief that we could do something with AI to drive those things. We don't think of ourselves as an AI platform. We are really trying to facilitate a transformation in the way that ed tech works to be able to work towards actual student learning and teacher productivity. And so we actually think of ourselves as reimagining what we call the ed tech stack. So reimagining what that high quality instruction looks like, because I honestly, if you started today, you probably wouldn't design a curriculum platform and that there's a bunch of different curriculums that a teacher has to manage, an LMS, an SIS that doesn't talk to each other. And so how can we reimagine that in a way that makes it make sense for what we know high quality teaching can look like? And so that brings me to kind of the paper here today, which is really our own thought leadership to really try to redefine what we think can be possible, because time savings is so important for educators, capacity is so important, but also how does that actually impact student learning is something that we actually don't think a lot of people have really focused on in terms of how AI is impacting the classroom. And that's really where we're really excited to kind of focus on over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I'll admit I was sandbagging a little bit in the introduction of, and I appreciate you naming, like, sure, you haven't served in a traditional teaching capacity, but I think, people talk about, getting to know your target audience before founding a company or as like the start of founding a company. you spent years in classrooms getting to know teachers, both with Chan Zuckerberg and with Brisk. Can you talk a little bit about, yeah, maybe even go to the pre-ChatGPT classroom of what were the types of problems you were seeing, and things that you had thought about that you're like, man, I wish that existed. I know this is a tool that needs to get built, and then maybe transition into how you've been able to leverage some of the advances of the past couple of years to start building those tools.
Precisely. I remember one thing in particular that we were really focused on in the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, which was timely feedback, being able to
Sure.
help students get feedback in a timely way. If you're delivering feedback on a student's work product 2 weeks later, the chances that a student truly internalizes that feedback and then incorporates that into their next instructional moment to practice that can be actually really hard. And so we actually were, during the pandemic and even before this, we were looking at what teachers were doing that were able to effectively implement high quality feedback in a timely way. And they'd often have these like really manual comment banks that they develop in like a Google sheet. And then they'd have their like assignment here. And then they'd be basically, trying to
Oh
find the
no.
and pasting it into the comment and then going again. And like, it just felt such a manual process that there had to be a better way. And so, they developing these really sophisticated comment banks and realizing that those were the teachers that were doing it effectively, right? That were actually able within a day or two able to get feedback on a early work product. And so, I seeing that we spent a lot of time pre-Chat GPT trying to replicate that, but make it easier within the product that we were building. But as soon as generative AI came out, I was like, there has to be a better way where we can take the context, we can take what learning science says those feedback comments should look like, but we can also match it to the actual content of the assignment and do it in such a more differentiated and personalized way. And so that's actually how we were able to develop our feedback tools in Brisk, where, one of the things that people really love about Brisk is we started as a browser extension, really to drive that instructional coherence. And so when we give feedback, you're not going to a separate platform. You're actually almost getting that personalized comment bank experience directly in the comments in Google Docs. So you don't actually need to be switching between different platforms in order to do it. And you just get that feedback, and it's much more personalized to the student's work product rather than just doing that rote copying and pasting from a comment bank that you might have created weeks or even years ago.
I think I just want to double down on what you're talking about here, which is like understanding that there are really important use cases in the classroom and around the classroom for human to human experiences, and others where the human is a bottleneck and honestly can be more of a problem than the solution. And I think feedback is sort of my favorite use case for this, in that yes, it would be great if every teacher could give one-on-one in-person feedback on every assignment. I think even the biggest detractors would understand that that's just not possible. And the next highest impact device you can use to provide feedback, or highest return device you can use to provide feedback is often a chatbot. And I think what you guys have done is said, well, how do we do this thoughtfully? How do we make sure this is only used for the right use cases for that? So it's not like every single assignment all the time only gets AI, but it's providing the teacher with a tool to get that feedback to students faster in the right instances.
I couldn't agree more. I think sometimes we act like it's like the AI or the teacher. And what we've seen
Right.
in this is that teachers are giving feedback at earlier points in the student work process that they never would have had the chance. That early draft where you can actually you can correct a student misconception or support a student with a probing question that never would have been asked. And instead, teachers really only have capacity frequently to come in at the summative point where they're actually evaluating student work. And so students aren't getting those at-bat opportunities to practice their skills and iterate to stay in productive struggle, which I think is so interesting, and I think is a direct conduit to what we're trying to communicate with instructional moments, which is the work that we're putting out, which is often the thought leadership around AI focusing on time savings acts like there is a certain amount of time in a day And basically, the success means automating all of it, right? It's a zero-sum game type of mentality. And what we're seeing in districts that we work with is that there's actually a positive sum solution where the teacher is still giving the feedback that they would have given, still grading the assignments, but now you have all of this additional opportunity that goes beyond what could have actually been facilitated in the classroom by itself. And so, how do you almost communicate that positive sum vision for AI that goes beyond what would have even been possible if a teacher had more time? And so, I think that's really where feedback is honestly such a great example, because the goal is not teachers spend less time grading assignments. The goal is students are getting feedback when they need it, and maybe a lot more of that feedback. And so that's just like a different mindset shift that I think hopefully we're able to start to push towards as we talk about AI in the classroom.
Yeah, and I think this gets us to the white paper, right? Of like, how do you measure that impact, and what are the vehicles that you're using to measure? So, could you start just I think most folks will still be familiarizing themselves with the white paper when they see this. Could you just give sort of the basic overview, and then maybe a couple of the key highlights, particularly around this sort of concept of measuring AI's impact in the classroom?
It's a really good question. And I think it was really born out of that feeling that we were not communicating AI's impact in the classroom effectively. So we spent some time with folks who are in the field who are thinking a lot about how to measure outcomes and effect sizes of different instructional interventions, like timely feedback, like creating differentiated supports. And we took it back and we tried to connect it to what we had seen over the course of the last 3 years. And we said there really needs to be this new concept of like an instructional moment that would not have been facilitated otherwise in the classroom, that impacts a student directly, whether it's an AI tutor that a student can engage with when they're completing an assignment at home so that they don't have to wait till the next day to be able to get support on a misconception that they have. And so we ended up building a framework to understand all the different ways in which we are hearing from the teachers that you and students that use Brisk that they're get benefiting. And we developed this framework around high quality instructional moments, noting also that AI is not necessarily abundantly good on itself. There are ways that as a teacher, you can use AI in a way that decreases the quality of instruction. And so how do we define what high quality instructional moments look like? Ones where the student is able to stay in productive struggle, when they're actually doing standards aligned work, when they're actually doing work that is aligned with their high quality instructional materials, and do that much more intentionally. And so our goals with this was to provide a starting point. Actually, the paper does not take a perspective on the weighting between these different types of instructional maneuvers. We think it really should be part of the space. We share how Brisk is doing that because I think it is an interesting opportunity that
Sure.
White is kind of like started to think about, which is like, okay, here are some examples of people who are moving the field forward. We, within our product, have a framework to basically within our data dashboard, we say, here are the instructional moments that we believe were facilitated by Brisk that would not have existed otherwise. And we think that's really important. So we have a weighting and we're very transparent about here, timely feedback. We've looked at John Hattie's work with effect sizes and connected it there. We're thinking about the differentiated materials that maybe, if you're in Wisconsin and you have Hmong as a language that you need to support, but you wouldn't have been able to create that adjacent resource for your students who can't directly engage within this material. That's a moment that might not have been facilitated otherwise. And how can we actually put together a quantitative framework to measure all of that? Brisk has a specific stab at what this looks like based on what we've worked with school districts, but we're hopeful that people can take this framework, add to it, tell us about instructional types of instruction that we may not have considered to incorporate into the framework, so that we as a space can kind of move towards this world where we're not just looking at the actions on the teacher side that are being used by AI, but how that's necessarily also impacting the student's experience of the classroom. Because I'm using feedback as a very specific example here, but I think it is helpful because it does help us think about, okay, that student is experiencing feedback a lot more soon, a lot faster, and they're able to revise as a result of that. And so, how do we measure that impact? Because that's also so important. And so, we're hopeful that this framework provides a first stab at that.
Yeah, and I think from my sort of analyst 30,000 foot point of view, it makes me much happier to see these as sort of published guidelines rather than proprietary sort of, quote unquote secret sauce. And the reason for that is the public perception is, I think, what you were saying before. And I think this is the genesis of a lot of the AI products out there, which was let's apply it to as many things as possible. Um, Maybe forgetting that we should have been a little bit more coordinated and a little bit more like scientific method driven in those applications. And I think this is the appropriate natural evolution of that work. And it's nice to have one of the market leaders driving it of like, okay, like we can't spray and pray. Like folks who are doing that, like, you know, you shouldn't be highlighted in this type of work. Instead, we'd like to highlight some of the things that we think are working. There's opportunities for others to contribute their own examples. This is what we think works. I think it's just really important. And I hope it contributes to the change in public perception to say like, okay, like here are the things that work. Here's some of the things that have failed so far. They may come around at a future date. And that might actually be a fun thing to talk through is like, what are some of the things that don't currently work with the knowledge we have of how learning works that, might change in the nearish term future of like, what's something that you'd like to be able to build, but aren't quite there yet?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think one thing that we're solving right now, and we see it is a very human intensive kind of aspect of it, but we'd love to make this more easier to implement for school districts, is we offer teachers the ability to level text in our product. So
Sure.
you can take any web page on the internet, we're a browser extension, the entire internet you can change the reading level of it instantly. Very helpful. A lot of teachers previously had products where they'd go into a resource bank with leveled text, try to find that one that was relevant to their lesson. Now, anything on the internet can be made as a leveled resource. However, what is so important often is how is this building up to grade level reading? And often we find that done improperly, tools like this could be used in a way that keeps students not engaging with grade level material. And so
Sure.
how are we using it as a scaffold to build back up? And so, this has been a concern that a lot of districts have communicated to us. And so over the last 2 years, we've actually built dashboards and custom solutions to make sure that as students are getting access to these resources, they're getting back to grade level rather than just being siloed at
Stagnant.
the specific grade level. And so it is a very data focused kind of endeavor. I believe that what we're doing now, which is to be able to allow the district to set guidance around exactly how leveling should work in specific contexts, and to actually give teachers the tools to actually not just necessarily, if I'm asking for a sixth grade reading level and I'm teaching ninth graders, how to think about what are the specific academic language that regardless I should be reintroducing, because we don't want students to be left behind because they can't access a ninth grade resource right away. And so there's a way in which a district can now it will in the future not just set context on, okay, now we're going to look at and hold teachers accountable for leveling text too much, and say, how can a district actually push those grade level texts to still incorporate the same academic language and concepts so a student doesn't get left behind? And I think that's an opportunity that we're going to see specifically in the next year or so get manifested as part of some of these agentic tools, because what an agent can allow you to do is specific pull in relevant context and say, okay, I'm leveling a text. I'm going to pull the tool in to identify the academic language that is important from this resource and reincorporate it back into the level text, which is not something that was possible before. So our team is really focused on solving those types of problems that are really important problems of practice for our space that might not exist in a general purpose AI tool, where that question around leveling text, but leveling it in such a way that can still build up to grade level context is such a specific problem.
And doing it in a way that is consistent with the whole student and the whole teacher workflow. You started off by talking about sort of having coherence across all the different platforms teachers use. And, I'm guessing that remains even however many years later from when y'all were founded. I'm guessing that remains a huge problem for teachers of like, how do I manage all this stuff? And being able to say like we are a layer across the board, and there are different ways we can step in to help that are appropriate for what the teacher needs and are helpful to the student. So I'm really excited for what you're building. I'm really excited that you are putting this out in public. I really appreciate companies that are willing to take a step forward and put themselves out there of saying, we think this is important. Here is our analysis. We're sharing this publicly in the name of the greater good rather than trying to keep it, close to the vest. Um, Thank you for that. I'm excited to read any subsequent editions of the report.
We're always excited to collaborate. It potentially could be my background as an engineer who always focused on open source software, but we
Yeah,
think of this as just like we are all here to build, not just build technology, but to actually support students. And it only works if we can share those practices widely because, we can't live in silos as an ecosystem.
couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for the time. Looking forward to continuing to follow along with y'all.
Thanks so much, Matt.